Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Native Market Success. Today, we will be presenting on Intro to Food Labeling in the USA, and I would like to introduce Maddie Griswold and Genesis Chavez, as well as Dr. Jane Bowles, who will be presenting and answering questions on this webinar piece. Maddie grew up in the mountains of central Idaho. Her passion for good food and our natural world led her to pursue a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Whitman College, and she is now seeking a master's degree in sustainable food systems at Montana State University. Genesis Chavez is currently enrolled in the Sustainable Food Systems Master's Program as well at MSU, and her profound interest is studying food systems emerged after witnessing the challenges that small farmers faced in the local markets in Nicaragua, her home country. Welcome, ladies, and thank you so much for being here today. I'll let you have the floor.
Thank you. Genesis, you can move on to slide 2.
Today, we would like to introduce our guest lecturer. It's Dr. Jane Bowles, an associate professor in the Department of Animal and Range Sciences, and she is also the manager of the meat lab. Dr. Bowles has a background in meat sciences and food safety, and that's also as well her research interest. And she is within the College of Agriculture at Montana State University. So welcome.
Thank you, Genesis.
All right, so as Brittany said, this is the first lecture in a 4-part series we're doing on food labeling. And this first lecture is really just a brief introduction to food labeling. The next 3 lectures will dive more deeply into the requirements and label application process for food products. And so we're going to try to do sort of a question and answer format today. And so Genesis and I will just be asking Dr. Bowles questions, and she will be answering them.
Thank you. And so here is our beginner question, and it's Dr. Bowles. How does a food producer get started into food labeling?
Well, it's really important that they understand the different parts that go into getting the label. One of them is that you have to have, in a processed product, you have to have a finished product. The application process requires you to include different amounts, what you're putting in it, and things like that. And it's really a good idea if you're planning on having a logo that you've had that logo already put together as well. Now, in the USDA realm, which is what I'm more familiar with, we have to have those all pre-approved. FDA is not as stringent in how those are being done. So usually on the FDA, somebody is checking it after the fact as opposed to prior to what it's going to be. The caveat to that is any health claims. And in a small realm, I usually say, unless you're utilizing one of the major already approved health claims, just don't do it because it's a really difficult process to do. So you need a product, you need to know where you're going to manufacture it and how you're going to package it. And that's what's going to go into the label application, which is the last step.
Thank you.
So you started to touch on this, but how do I know if my product labeling needs to follow USDA or FDA regulations?
Now that one, because we're talking of who we're talking to, that gets a little more difficult than what it usually is. Usually when I'm talking about straight meat products, if you have 2% red meat or 3% poultry, it has to go under USDA, and if that goes under USDA inspection. Now there is one caveat to that, and that is bison or any of the species that are classified as non-amiable species. And a non-amiable species is basically bison, elk, deer, The one wild species that is not under that is your ratites, which are your ostrich and your emu. But in general, those things are under FDA, while all of the rest of the what we would consider domestic species goes under USDA.
Awesome. Thanks for that clarification.
So our next question is, what are the FDA required types of information that every food label must contain?
When you're looking at it on your food label, when we're talking about this, in general, all labels must go back to what we call the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It is under, if you're looking for it, there is a publication called the Code of Federal Regulations. That Code of Federal Regulations is basically the description of everything government regulates. And when we're looking at it, all of the FDA stuff that is looking at labeling is in Chapter 21. And it has all of the information. It describes what a principal display panel is, what has to be on this principal display panel, which is the name of the product and the weight of the product, as long as it's packaged. You can do what we call catch weight, which means there's a secondary label that gives you the weight of the product later. But those two pieces have to be on it. You have to identify what the product is. And if you only have a single label, it has to have the ingredient list. And probably the most important piece when you're looking at it is the ingredient list, because that's going to identify what is actually in the product. And that also is where we're looking for different pieces that go into that product. So you have those processes. The standards that are on the labels are widely varied, because when we talk about display panel, we usually talk about the front. Well, if you have something that's round like you see in that tomato soup, it's hard to identify the front. So the front becomes wherever you put all of that information. Another good place to look at that is a Pringles can, because again, it's round. Now, the other caveat to the requirements that go on the label is how big is that label? There's a lot of different descriptions in the code that tells you where those pieces have to be. And for example, the net weight also has to have a different font than everything else. It has to stand out. And they are very picky about whether or not that is going to be easily seen. And some of the later pieces will talk about how to put in your identifying flavors and things like that, because those are your identity of the product. So those will be in later sections.
Right, thank you so much for diving into the different types of information, and we will continue to cover more details about it in the upcoming lectures.
So what information must be included in the nutritional facts label?
The nutritional label requires the total fat, which is saturated in trans fat, cholesterol, sodium, your carbohydrates, and it's supposed to include added sugars, which can be sometimes problematic, especially in a fermented product, because you add sugar, but it's no longer there at the final product. So that can be a little bit problematic. They did change the format about 3 years ago. And there's another caveat with the nutritional labels, especially if you're looking at something that is a smaller package. If the smaller package could conceivably be consumed as the whole package, as your serving size, then they have to have 2 labels. One that says what the serving size is, and right beside it, it's the whole package. And this was, it's really obvious in things like ice cream, when they have the smaller containers, where they actually have those bits of information that have to be there. You don't see it as much in meat products, because the serving size, especially on the packaged products and like jerky, they just do the whole package. The It's usually a full package. So it's not quite as problematic as it once was. Now, when you're looking at nutritional labels, there is a exemption for small groups. So there is an exemption based on amount of product sold. So when you're looking at a very small company, they don't necessarily have to have nutritional facts. They can if they want to, but it is not a requirement, because in the starting piece, there's a collection of testing that has to go on beforehand, especially for those, if you're talking about the saturated fatty acids, and that's where you need a lot of that for the meat products. That has to be done ahead of time, and that is rather expensive. So sometimes you want to make sure your product is going to actually make it in the marketplace before you go and do the nutritional labeling. So there's is a spot for smaller companies not to have to do that. Now, if you're doing fresh meat, if you're doing raw meat, there are standard ones that you can get from USDA, and it can be posted at point of sale. So the raw product, a lot of those are supposed to have, now I haven't been in a grocery store recently that actually has the point of sale, but they are supposed to have point of sale so that you can look and see what those are. So that is what the way you have to deal with anything that is a raw product, because that becomes a little bit more difficult. Whole products, they don't, for example, an orange does not require a nutritional labeling, because you can look that up. So there are some caveats to when nutritional facts have to be on the label that you need to consider, because sometimes you want to make sure you have the product that's going to work before you actually put the money into doing all the testing that has to go for the nutrition label.
That's great. And so I'm wondering if you can just give an example of like testing out your product in the market. Are you thinking, could that be someone like selling at a farmer's market, direct to consumer, or what's like an example of how a smaller business who's trying to get going would be able to,
as long as they're, I don't remember the actual dollar value. It's quite high. As long as they're under a specific dollar value, they do not have to do nutritional labeling. Now, there is some problems with that, because if your person who is carrying your product requires nutritional labeling, then you will have to put it on there. But in general, if you're doing a small processor who hasn't got that large of a product base yet, they don't actually need to do the nutritional labeling. So when I say try it out in the marketplace, it just depends on what the product is and where they're going with it. I mean, if you're going to the grocery store, are you wanting to do it, like you said, in the farmer's market? Are you wanting to do it as a online sale? And that is a whole different process. And so, and USDA and FDA both don't have real good directions or information on how to deal with the online stuff, because especially in the meat realm, we have state inspected plants. Well, a state inspected plant can sell within the state. That's the definition of a state inspected plant, but they can't sell across the border unless they're at a special level. There is a newer proviso that allows you to do it, but the state itself has to apply for that level of inspection. So that has created some confusion when we're looking at online sales. So a lot of the folks that do online sales just go direct, especially in the meat realm, go directly to a federal plant, so they don't have to worry about that.
Great, that's super helpful information. Thank you.
So moving on, we started talking a little bit more about what are the different labeling requirements if products are being sold as a wholesale or in a retail environment.
Okay, when we're talking about wholesale, wholesale has a definition through the government. So that is anybody supplying a retail outlet. And so the picture you have there is of bulk food. Well, that bulk food is still considered retail. It is not considered wholesale. the bigger picture and how you label the outside box that is going to take those products to the retail has to have the same information that the individual package does. It's just usually not the pretty pictures. It's usually a black and white, easily printed label that sticks on the outside of the box. But it does require that you have a information about what's in the box. So it has to be the name of the product. It's supposed to have the processor on it, and it's supposed to have if it's a meat product, it has to have the inspection label as well. So you have to have that, follow it all the way, and it should be on the outside of the box if it is not on the inside of the box. So if it's not on the label proper, then it has to be on the outside of the box. If we have every single package in the box labeled, then it can avoid using that inspection label, what we call a bug. If it's federal, it's round. If it's Montana, it looks like the state of Montana, and it basically indicates that it's an inspected and passed product. Retail product has to have all of the information that we discussed before. It has to have the identifying flavor. It has to have the product, what's in it, who manufactured it, what is the ingredient list, what is the net weight. All of those things have to be on a retail package. So the wholesale one usually has, or that outer container, that labeling of the outer container can be simpler, as long as everything within the box has all of the product. So once it leaves, whoever made it, it has to have all of the pieces on it so that when it gets to its destination, they can take it out. Now, if they are going to do the catch weight, then some of that can be later, so that they can do that. But most of the time on catch weight, it's cut in-house. So that's usually, that's pretty much, there aren't really any differences. It's just how pretty the label is.
Thank you.
Okay, so what about food allergens? What are the major food allergens? I guess you can see them here. And at what point do I need to declare them?
All food allergens must be declared. There is a caveat for small plants that if they list every single ingredient, and that's under the meat area. If you list every single ingredient, then you do not necessarily have to put a separate statement that says contains milk, contains soy, contains wheat. A lot of the people are changing their labels so that they can actually just put the little caveat below it. There is a size requirement and the bold face. So those are supposed to both go with it. The most common ones that are in meat products are basically milk, eggs, wheat, and soy, with some tree nuts, depending on who's making what. But those are your major allergens. There has to be some indication somewhere on the package that those products are in there. And you do need to double check any multi-ingredient product you're using to see that you actually identify the individual allergens. For example, soy sauce is not all soy sauces are equal. Some of them have wheat, some of them don't. All of them have soy, that's the term soy sauce. So when you see that, you need to indicate that there is soybeans in there, or there is something like soy in there. But there is a significant number of the soy sauces that will have wheat in it. So you do need to look at those individual ingredients that you're putting in and also identify anything in there. And it's a good idea when you're ordering product to double check that it's still the same as what you thought it was. We've had several recalls associated with an allergen that was because the ingredient supplier changed their ingredient list and didn't tell someone. So it's really important that once you get a new batch of a specific ingredient, that you double check to make sure that there hasn't been a change in that, because there's been some really big recalls in really big companies that were associated with an ingredient change that nobody noticed. And that applies to everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. Allergens are one of those things. It doesn't matter. You have to indicate whether or not you have them.
Are we hoping to see a new ingredient listed in the food allergen group?
Could you repeat the question?
Are we expected to see a new food allergen listed in this group?
If you are adding a multi-ingredient product, you will need to note whether or not you will need to be able to look at it. They have to supply the ingredient list, because even though it's a wholesale product, it still has to have the ingredient list. So you should go through it and look at it. Now, there is one of the saving graces to this is that little piece on the ingredient statement that allows you to do less than 2%. Allergens cannot go in that less than 2%. All allergens have to be on the other side. And interestingly enough, several of the root vegetables have to be on the other side. I'm not real sure I understand why, but onion and garlic have to be labeled. Not sure why. And I have tried to find that information because I have run across it in a different place, but the Code of Federal Regulations is not an easy place to search. And so I haven't actually found where it is. I have just encountered it on different label applications.
Awesome, thank you. And just a new fact that was recently released. So the FASTER Act announced that sesame is going to be listed as the 9th food allergen ingredient, and this it's going to be active or effective since January 1st of 2023. So we're going to also have a new food ingredient here.
The sesame is not a common one in meat products, but it is something that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. So moving forward, what are the next steps? What about the product claims? What do they really mean?
Product claims are interesting. USDA grade, when you're looking at that has to be applied by a USDA grader. No one else can do it. No one can say it. It has to be registered with the Ag Marketing Service, who supplies the graders for the grade. No additives, that is a subjective thing. That one, you need to actually say what is not added. We have a lot of what we call clean labels, which are addressing this no additives portion, and it does depend on what people consider no additives. So it should be very specific as to what is not added. So no antioxidants added, or no BHA, BHT added. It needs to be very specific. Anything that goes along with the no additives has to be reflected in the application for your label. The fresh, never frozen, that one is interesting. I've had that one asked several times recently because of chicken. You'll go in and you'll find chicken that feels frosty, and they're working on the assumption that it has been frozen and it's been thawed, even though it says fresh, never frozen. Well, what happens is the definition for frozen is actually anything less than 0. Or no, excuse me, that's not right. Anything less than I'm translating from Celsius at the moment. It's anything less than 20 degrees Fahrenheit, something similar to that. Meat actually doesn't freeze until 28 Fahrenheit. So what you're seeing on the surface of that is liquid that is on the surface that has gone into ice crystals. The meat itself has never been frozen. So that's where that one's looking at. And there is a very specific definition for that. And it's usually used on poultry. I haven't seen it too much on anything else, but it's usually on that. Tenderness claims has to have something to back it up. There has to be some form of measurement that's doing it or something similar. The no hormones added, same thing. There has to be an affidavit that goes along with them that indicates that these animals have never been treated. Interestingly enough, there have been no hormones ever approved for use in pork and poultry. So that's the reason if you see no hormones added on one of those labels, there has to be a caveat that says that that has never been approved by the by USDA for use in those animals. Nutritional claims, like I said, when I was indicating earlier, unless you're using the ones that have already been approved, don't do it. It's just too difficult to prove. The process of getting a new nutritional claim made is very difficult, and it's going to not be something a small processor can do. It took General Mills almost 15 years to convince FDA to allow them to give them the heart healthy piece for Cheerios. That's how long it took them and how much data they had to have before they would actually add that piece of information. Now, are they happening a little faster now? Yes, because that was one of the first nutritional claims that was made. Non-GMOs, if you're looking at meat products, there aren't any GMOs with the exception of the salmon. There is one interesting cow, but it's in South America, that is a GMO. And you have to be really careful on what that is because it's the definition of a GMO. USDA has a definition, so does FDA of what is a GMO. So you do need to be cautious that you're actually addressing that piece because they are talking about actual genes being spliced into the DNA, whereas selection or breeding is not considered a GMO. And natural has no definition, period. It's the story. In the meat realm, there used to be a definition, and FDA challenged USDA over it, and the Ag Marketing Service was more than willing to give it back to FDA because they didn't like dealing with it. And that happened in, I believe, 2017, and they still don't have a definition. So they've been very slow to come around to what is going to happen with that natural. So currently they're following the old, at least on the meat realm, everybody just does what they used to do, which means it is minimally processed. That's basically it. It's minimally processed, which is basically all. And they won't have nitrites or the chemical compound nitrite added, or most of them, especially on the beef realm, will tell you that there's no implants used. So, but for natural, there has to be a story that goes with the application. That's how they decide. And then you're going to have affidavits that go along with it that make sure that those actually go.
Awesome. This is a pretty comprehensive overview of claims and a lot of detail. Thank you for going in this and help us to navigate them. And there are many more, but we will continue to talk about it in our upcoming lectures. So we're moving forward and
So are there any different or unique food labeling regulations or requirements for tribal communities that you can talk about?
As I indicated earlier, all of the labeling requirements under 21 CFR have to be met. That is a federal regulation. That's about every product. Now, does it always happen? No. There's times when it doesn't happen. However, the tribal community can make other pieces, because what is said is the minimum is what they have. That is the minimum. Even states can require other parts of labeling if they desire. And a good example of that is what happens in California for a lot of different products. There's a lot of things that have different labels because the state of California has made a specific ruling that says this must be labeled. So the tribal community can make a different one. And if I were them, I would actually use something similar to like Montana Made that says that it's very specific for the tribe. So that you have that identifier that shows up in wherever they're selling it. And they could create a system similar to the Montana Made that gives them the ability to make sure that anything that's using that label meets what they want it to meet. So there is things they can do, but they can't change the fact that they need a name, which, okay, let's face it, that's a good idea. The net weight is really important because that's commerce, and who processed it and whether or not it's been inspected. So those things, I'm pretty sure everybody would agree that's important because it's something that is necessary. But the tribal community can do extra if they want. They can develop generic based labels that people can actually utilize on their product. There's lots of different ways to approach that if you wanted to make your product stand out, or to make sure that what is being sold is actually meeting what the tribal community wants to do. But the basics, it doesn't matter where it is, it has to be met.
Great, thank you. And that's it.
So, well, this been a really great time, very, very informative. We are really thankful with Dr. Janice Wall for her time. And these lectures also being supported by the Western Third Grant and Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, the EHAD department at Montana State, and the College of Agriculture. The Food Product Development Laboratory, and this is material, it's based upon the work that is supported by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the USDA Department of Agriculture. And for sure, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the land we are in. And so built on the traditional territories of the Apostolic Nms First and Lakota and Blackfeet Salish, Shoshonic and Northern Cheyenne nations. So thank you, Maddie. Thank you, Dr. Walls.
Thank you so much, ladies. We will have contact info available on the webinar post, and really appreciate your time today. That was fantastic information. Thank you.
Thank you.